Hi class, it's Bill Berry with another video in the JavaScript series. We are getting started. We're in our second chapter, and we are learning some critical tools that we're needing to prepare to write scripts. And now we're actually getting into some coding, right? We're actually starting to learn some of the fundamentals that we need to write interesting programs. So the critical concept that we're talking about in this lesson is variables. We are storing things for later use. It's typical that you gather information or that you have some information at one point in the program, but later in the program on a separate line later, you need to use that same information. So you don't want to have to ask the user for it again. If you've asked the user for their name or their age or whatever, you need to be able to hold on to that so that you can use it in some future calculation, some future display, etc. Let me give you a counter example and tell you why this is so important. So let's jump over to our typical starter script where we said hello. Well, we learned in the last chapter, in the introductory week's lessons, that we could ask the user a question. So we could say something like prompt, enter your name, right? And then we put the default, don't forget that part, which is great. You can ask them their name, but if you just have the prompt sitting on a line like this, it's just going to throw away the name, right? You're going to ask them and it's just going to discard it because you haven't put it anywhere, you haven't stored it anywhere, you haven't used it anywhere. So we can just take this whole thing out. I'm just going to cut it and I'm going to replace the hello with it. That's great. So now I'm going to prompt the user for their name and then I'm going to write it out. So as you might remember, it's going to look something like this. What's your name? Bill. Bill. Great. So it knows to write that information out. Well, that's still not really satisfying. What if I want to say hello to the person? Well, I can concatenate hello, comma, plus the answer to the prompt. So I prompt them for their name. I take the result of that, I concatenate it onto the word hello, and then I write it out. That's going to work, and you'll see that if I save it, it does its thing, right? Bill, hello Bill, great. Well, that works, but you're going to see that the beginner brain is already exploding. Like there's too much stuff happening on this line. It would be a lot better if I could sort of reverse time here, and instead of asking them for their name and then having to consume it right that second, it would be better if I could store it somewhere, right? So that's the whole concept of a variable, is that I can store the information at one point and use it as at a later point. So jumping back to our slides, that's exactly what a variable does. So there's a couple of things we need to know about that. If you want to create a variable to store something, you use the keyword var. And so you say var and then you give it a name. We'll learn the real specifics about naming these a little bit later. We just want to get started. So you say var, you then name the variable, right? Some start with a letter usually. We'll talk about it again. And don't use spaces, right? That's the key thing about names, is the variable names. They can't have spaces in them. And then the other thing that we need to know is that we are going to be using the assignment operator. And the assignment operator is a single equal sign. Now, it's an unfortunate thing that it has to use equal, because that makes our brain think that it's about equality, and it's really not. The equal sign is the assignment operator, and it means you're assigning the value of a variable. So that's a little bit hard to get used to if you're not a programmer, but modern languages use that. Now there have been some languages along the way that have made a different symbol so you didn't get confused, but it's kind of, we're just sort of stuck with using it the way it is. So you have to think about the equal sign saying, let this variable have the value of, right? Let me assign the variable this value. So that's what we need to do to make a variable. So let's look at some simple examples. I'm creating a variable called username. Notice the way it's capitalized. This is kind of typical. It's called camel casing because the first letter is lowercase, and then if you have multiple words, you uppercase the first letter of those other words. Camel casing. So we create a variable called username. And then you can either at that point or at a later point give it a value. So in this case, later in the code, I can say username equals, remember, is assigned to, username is assigned the value Chris. So I've stored the word Chris, text literal, in the variable called username, and in the future I can refer to username and get the value Chris, right? It's like the example would be, If you ask someone to hold some money, let's say you have a $5 bill and you say, can you hold my money for me? You give them the $5. In the future, all you have to do is sort of gesture and say, money, and then they understand that you want your money. So by using the same word, money in this case, the $5 gets summoned, right? It's going to use that value. You're going to get your money out when you talk about that. Same thing here. In the future, if you refer to the name username, the variable, just refer to its name. It's going to automatically be translated into Chris, which is what's in the variable, right? It's in the little box in memory. Another example here, we're creating a variable called user age and assigning it the value 29. So create the variable called user age, assign it the value 29. So when you want to create variables, you just do them this way, right? Now, notice one other thing here is we don't use var again and again. If we've already created the variable once, we don't say var again, we just refer to the name from then on. So that's an important point, and I think that's, two important things that are listed here in the little callouts. All right, so let's look at a little more about how variables can be used. All right, so here's another example. You can put any kind of data that you want. You can put text in, you can put numbers in, like you just store whatever you want and you just throw it in the variable, and that's great. And as I mentioned before, you just mention its name and it's going to automatically summon the contents, right? Like money, I say money, I get my $5. So here's an example where I say var rent due equal 780. How do you read that? Create a variable called rent due, assign it the value 780. Great. So what can we do with that in the future? Well, you can use it anywhere you would be able to use the 780 and it will just work. So for instance, I can create another variable called late rent and assign it the value of rent due plus 35. This is now an expression. When it sees rent due, it knows you mean 780. So it's going to say, oh, you mean 780 plus 35, that's 815. It will calculate that result and then it will put it into the variable called late rent. So after this line of code, late rent has 815 in it. Listen to that back a couple times if you want to walk through it and get your brain straight on it. But the idea here is the variable, using the name of the variable, is going to summon its contents and then it's going to continue in doing what it needs to do. Now, another little piece here is that you can create more than one variable at a time and in fact give more data in the variable, assign values on a single line. So I can say var username equals Pat and then notice a comma, and then another variable called user age is assigned the value 29. You don't have to say var again here. So var kind of is assumed to go across whatever number of them you have here. Not too common that we do that, but sometimes we have several things that are related that we might want to give names and values to on a single line. So that's just a little bit about how variables are named, how they're created, and how they're used. But we want to sort of look a little more deeply and make sure that we understand. Let's look at some other examples, right? So here's some questions to see if we can answer. First thing is, if we have a variable that we're creating called custName and we put Joe into it and we take custAge and we put 39 into it, the question is, what do each one of these things do? Keep in mind, when you see the equal sign, it does not mean equal. Maybe don't even read it as equal. Say custName gets the value of. CustName is assigned the value of, right? Think of it that way and read it that way and that'll help. So what does this one do? CustName equals custName plus schmo. Now, if you are confused, one thing I recommend is cover up the left part with your finger, like hide this from your eyes, right? So you don't even see it. I could color it with black highlighter so that you can get the idea. But pay attention to the thing on the right of the equal sign and evaluate that first. So what is custName plus space schmo as a literal? Well, go get the value from the box or the memory variable called custName, that happens to be Joe, concatenate onto it the plus and the schmo, evaluate the result of that. That's going to be Joe space schmo, a text result, and then it's going to store that into the variable called custName. So read this part and evaluate it, then read the is assigned the value of, and then put it into this variable. So I think you'll see that custName should end up with Joe Schmo. How about this one, right? Again, cover up the left side. Take cust age, what's in that? That's 39. Add 1 to 39, that makes 40. 40 then is going to be on the right side, that's the result of the expression. Then assign that to the variable called cust age. So after this line, cust age should contain the number 40. All right, how about this one? Cover up the left side. Cuss name, that's Joe. In fact, it's Joe Schmo at this point, right? Because we've added on and stored it back in the customer name variable. So Joe Schmo plus cust age. Cust age is now 40. So what is Joe Schmo concatenated to 40? Again, when this is text, it's going to concatenate, not add. So what does name age contain? That should be Joe Schmo 40. So let's look at all the answers to that. Hopefully you got that. Notice when you concatenate, you don't get an automatic space. So if you wanted a space in there, you've got to go concatenate it yourself. So that gives you some ideas about how these things work. And again, a fairly good hint to get you started. When you're a beginner, you need to be able to understand this assignment business. Cover up the left-hand side thing on the left of the equals, evaluate the thing on the right, and then think about that variable name is assigned the value of whatever that result was. So those hints are listed here so that you can have a better understanding. Stop and play that back and listen again, or look at that carefully and see if you can make sure that you understand how these things arrive. All right, so let's look at one fuller example with more variables that solves real problems. So here we go. All right, here's a full example. So if you're in class, you can grab this code from our Canvas, and if not, then you can certainly pause and type this in if you want to practice it. So let's see if we can read this together and understand what's happening. Create a variable called custName. Assign to it the value Dana Duffy. Also create a variable called customer phone and assign it the value of this phone number. Document.write. What are we writing? Customer colon space custName plus a tag that is a break tag. So what is this going to write on a line? It's going to find custName. It's going to turn it into the value Dana Duffy. It's going to write customer colon space Dana Duffy, and it's going to concatenate to that a break, which is going to go to the next line. So we're going to get customer colon space Dana Duffy, and then it's going to move to the next line. Similarly here, it's going to say phone. It's going to add in the phone for Dana, which is the 206, blah, 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 and then it's going to concatenate two breaks. So we should see phone colon, then the phone number, and then two breaks. So we should move down two lines, right? So that should make sense. What about down here? I create tax rate, put a 0.1 in it. I create a variable called subtotal and put 135.69 in it. Then I calculate tax by taking subtotal times the tax rate. This is going to take the 135.69 multiplied by the tax rate. It's going to take the result of that and store it in a variable called tax. Then it's going to take the subtotal and the tax, add those together, and put it in a variable called total. So do you see that we can use this data multiple times? We can keep using the data because it's stored in variables, so we can just grab it out and use it anytime we want. Next, down here, we write out some information. We write out the subtotal, we write out the tax, we write out the total. So all of that stuff is going to do exactly what we want, and it lets us do it with variables step by step. So we can store it and then use it and use it again later if we want. We don't have to consume it at that moment like we did before. So variables are a super important thing for us to know about. They're important in every language, and certainly for beginners it takes a while to get this idea, but it's a critical concept that you need to understand. So go back and watch that if you'd like again. And make sure that your eyeballs can start following those examples and reading them out loud to yourself so that you get a really clear picture of how those things work. Now, if you're in class, of course, we're going to do some challenges together like this. But if we're not in class, you could certainly stop and work on this separately if you like. But this is a good simple challenge if you'd like to try to take it on. Now, in the next video, we're going to start talking about internal documentation. Now that our code can get longer and more complex, how do we make sure it's easy to read? That's for us and that's for other people as well. How do we do that? So that's a subject for the next video, but this one's getting long enough, so let's stop it and then we'll continue on there. Thanks for watching.